Coming up on today's show, Eve Rickert and Andrea Zanin. Eve Rickert is a Gen X, queer, solo polyamorous, relationship anarchist, neurodivergent cis woman. She is the curator of the More Than Two Essentials series and the non-monogamy resource site, morethantwo.ca, the founder and publisher of Thornapple Press, and the founder and mastermind of the science communications firm Talk Science to Me. Andrea Zanin, M.A., is a white, non-binary, middle-aged queer writer. Andrea is the author of Post-Nonmonogamy and Beyond, part of the More Than Two Essentials series, and has written for the Globe and Mail, the Tyee, Bitch, Ms., Xtra, In Magazine, Outlooks Magazine, and the Montreal Mirror. Andrea blogs at sexgeek.wordpress.com, where they created the 10 rules for happy non-monogamy and coined the term polynormativity. Welcome to Loving Without Boundaries, where we hear inspiring stories, share actionable advice, and talk about the challenges and the joys of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I'm your host, Kitty Shambliss. Welcome back to Loving Without Boundaries, where I am really excited to be here with Andrea Zanin and Eve Rickert. Eve, of course, has been on the podcast in the past, and I am delighted to have you both here to talk about the books that you recently co-wrote together, Post-Nonmonogamy and Beyond, a More Than Two Essentials Guide, and More Than Two, Cultivating Non-Monogamous Relationships with Kindness and Integrity. So welcome to the show, and I'm delighted to have a beautiful conversation with both of you.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Thank you.
Of course. I'd love to give you space to introduce yourselves in your own words. So maybe since I'm getting to meet you, Andrea, how about you go first?
Sure. So I am a queer, middle-aged writer, non-binary. I use they pronouns, and I live in Toronto and post-non-monogamy. So I've been a long-time blogger at sexgeek.wordpress.com, although not nearly as much in the last number of years, among others because I've been writing books. And so my own first book is Post-Nonmonogamy and Beyond, which is out with Thornapple Press. And then Eve and I co-authored the second edition, so More Than Two second edition together just recently. And I've written in a bunch of other places and done a bunch of other things, but that's probably the most important stuff for now. Most of my background is in non-monogamy, queer sexuality, and kink and BDSM leather.
Thank you for letting me get to know you a little bit better, and I'm really thrilled to further that conversation. And Eve, I'd love to hear an intro from you as well.
Sure. I'm Eve Rickert. I live on unceded ancestral territory of the Lekwungen and Saanich people, colonially known as Victoria, British Columbia. And I am the co-author of the first and second edition of More Than Two. And I'm the founder of and publisher of Thornapple Press, which publishes books on relationships and sexuality, including non-monogamy. I'm also the founder and mastermind of the science communications company Talk Science to Me.
Amazing. And I remember we got to meet in person at least once at Southwest Love Fest in Tucson, Arizona, a number of years ago.
You were there this year, weren't you?
I wasn't.
Oh, okay. There was at least one year, I think, where we were there, and we just waved in passing as well. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I was there twice, but I know I at least got to have like a full-on conversation with you that 1 year.
Yeah. Southwest Love Fest. I think that was 2019. That was the birthplace of Polysecure as well. So.
Yes, that was a great year. That was my first year I'd ever been there. It was amazing. So I'd love to ask you each what I call the light bulb question, and I'll start with Andrea, which is simply whether it was in your youth or maybe a little bit later on, when was there maybe a moment or maybe a series of moments where you realized you may not be like a lot of either the other people around me, and you may be coloring outside of the lines of heteronormative monogamy, or maybe not on the relationship escalator, or whatever that was for you? Does something come to mind for you, Andrea?
I don't actually have a single light bulb moment. I think for me, it's always been like an ongoing question of learning, right? And a lot of that learning, I think, I think for a lot of people, any kind of coming out story often looks like, I thought I was one thing, and then I suddenly had this realization because an event happened or something, some realization occurred, that I'm different. And for me, it was more like, I am me, I'm all these things. And as a child and as I grew up, just sort of over and over realizing that other people weren't. Mm-hmm. Like I think with the egocentrism of a tiny child, you just sort of assume everyone's like you. And then as you differentiate, as you age, you sort of go, wait a minute, oh, here's not, and some of those small realizations were like, I'm not safe. I have to be quiet about, for instance, being queer or whatever. And some of it was also like, okay, I'm a teenager and everyone around me is, clearly has a lot of interest in a lot of other people, but we're all supposed to partner up with just one person. And then like, okay, like each person that I partner up with seems to have like a different understanding of how that's supposed to go. So, did they all get a rule book that I didn't get? But wait a minute, but they're also kind of different from each other in these different rule books. And so I feel like I spent a lot of time just going, can you tell me how this works? I'm not sure I fully get it. And that question is actually kind of upsetting to a lot of people. And so it was like, yeah, I had a lot of very well-intentioned trying to figure it out and not wanting to hurt anyone. And then a lot of, just feeling like I was sort of bouncing from one person's rule book to the next until finally I came across the notion of non-monogamy in my sort of late teens, early 20s. And I was like, oh, there's like language for this. This is a thing that people do. And it's just intuitively made so much more sense because it wasn't about having a rule book. It was about coming up with it together. And I was like, that really works for me. Yeah. And, coming into kink and coming into queer community, they were also similar in the sense of like, oh, I finally have found my people and doing things that I am interested in doing. And now I have new things I can learn from them. Right. Like there's more that I can. Yeah. So that happened for me when I was in my late teens and early 20s in Montreal, where I lived for a very long time. So I was blessed to be in a place where there was a lot going on to learn from. Yeah.
That's thank you for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with that. And when I ask this question, I rarely get the same answer twice. So it's always a fascinating question. And I'm happy for you in the sense that I didn't even learn the word polyamory or understand open relationships until my late 30s. So I'm delighted that you got to have that world open up to you at an earlier age so that you can also be here doing the fine work that you're doing.
I mean, me too. And then like at the same time, I'm like, oh my God, early 20s, man, there are people who figure this out when they're 12 these days. Like,
true. Yeah. It's definitely generational, I think.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd love to ask that same question of you, Eve. It'll be fun to see how you did answer previously, which was, as you said, a number of years ago, 5 years ago. But what would you say is maybe your light bulb moment of when you realized that you may be walking to the beat of a different drum, or however you would find that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky for me because like I've always known that I've been different, like for as long as I can remember in various ways. And so it's just sort of like, having always felt like an outsider, I don't know that there's ever been a moment like, oh, this thing about me is different. As a teenager, like it's funny, my first kiss was actually with a girl when I was, I think, 11 or 12. But I forgot about it. And then I had my first kiss with a guy when I was 14. And then for like a couple of decades, the story in my head was my first kiss. That was my first kiss with that guy. And until I realized, like, wait a minute, no, like I kissed a girl. And I didn't even remember, like, that didn't even register with me as my first kiss because, like, it didn't register with me at the time as, like, a real kiss, right? So that was kind of interesting. But, in high school, like, everyone that I associated with was, kind of weird in some way. And so there was a lot of sort of casual queerness, or, like, just flirting with queerness in our circles. I was in the Rocky Horror Picture Show floor show cast starting when I was 14. So, I had a crush on one of my best friends. But there wasn't, because I was hanging out with a bunch of people who were like me, there wasn't a sense of like, oh, I'm different. There was a sense of like, oh, we're different, but then as I got older and got into university and in my 20s, I think I tried to like walk a more conventional path, and it wasn't intentional. I think I just sort of like defaulted to that. It wasn't like there was a moment I was like, oh, I need to stop this. It was just like, this is how life is. So I got into a monogamous relationship. I got married when I was 25. And then I have a pretty conventional opening up story of, my husband at the time and I, deciding together on non-monogamy. And so there was maybe a light bulb moment there when, we were reading a book together. The book was Skipping Toward Gomorrah by Dan Savage, and there's a chapter on swinging. And we sort of started talking about non-monogamy at that point. So that was like my adult moment. And so from there, it was sort of this like rediscovery, I guess, of all like, learning now what non-monogamy means to me. I think as a teenager, certainly there was non-monogamy happening in my social circles, but it wasn't discussed as a framework. It was just one of the weird things we did. and blew up on us a few times. But so, as an adult, that was when I sort of started exploring it as a framework and really trying to like learn how to do it right and all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And by the way, incidentally, I, as an adult, it was probably in my about my mid 40s. I was in a band where we did the Rocky Horror Picture Show live in costume in front of a studio audience, so that's interesting that you did that back then too. But it sounds like you had a beautiful community surrounding you to at least not feel alone by yourself, even though you realized that the group was a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that to some extent, having that sort of creative aspect of it. I mean, for me, I can't speak for anyone else's experiences. It's just like, 30 years hindsight. But like, I think it allowed us to sort of be playful with those identities without having to really, commit to them or think about what it would really mean to be that in the world. And I don't know if that's a positive or negative thing, but, like I was, regularly like playing gender bending roles and queer roles, and there wasn't a lot of crossover of like, oh, does this mean I am, I mean, I knew I was bisexual from a pretty young age, but I don't know, I think the ability to sort of play with that and try it on maybe took some of the pressure off of actually having to think a lot about it for me.
Yeah and thank you for sharing that. And again, I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with what you expressed there. So I'd love to understand, how did you two come to know each other, to start collaborating and working with each other? Tell me a little bit about that story.
I mean, I read the first edition of More Than Two, but we had met before that, or just, I'm trying to remember. I guess it might have been just before that.
I think we met just after, well, yeah. We met in early 2015, so More Than Two had been out for about 6 months. So I think you may have already read the book at that point, but maybe not that long ago.
Yeah, okay. So that makes sense.
We talked to each other on Twitter, so it's like all very murky. When exactly did we meet? So,
oh, I see.
First face-to-face was 2015.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I remember reading it and reviewing it and on my blog at the time. And then I think you were down for some reason in Toronto and invited me to come meet you. So I did, and it was nice. And then we sort of kept in touch, and I guess that happened. Did that happen twice before we started working together?
Yeah, I think when my former co-author and I were in Toronto in like I want to say either 2016 or 2018, the three of us had lunch. But so I'm a publisher, and I run a publication support company that offers like writing, editing, and design services. And Andrea is an editor and translator. So, being familiar with their work, I started reaching out to them probably around 2017 or so, asking for their help with various editing projects, and including substantive editing for Thornapple Press. At the time, it was Thorntree Press. So substantive editing is sort of like the first pass big edit where you deal with like the content and flow and structure of an edit before you're getting down into sort of like word choice. And Andrea was an obvious choice for that, both because of their editing experience and their content expertise. So I started hiring them for those edits, and then for also for edits for some of the Talk Science to Me clients as well. And yeah, it grew out of that. So Andrea was originally going to be my editor for this book, and the role kind of ballooned as we got it over time.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Yeah. I love hearing those type of stories of just how people meet, and especially in today's world with social media, that makes a lot of sense that it became kind of murky, especially with Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me about the book Post-Nonmonogamy and Beyond, a More Than Two Essentials guide. And I understand that is part of the More Than Two Essentials series, which is exciting. So tell me a little bit about the germ of an idea of doing that book and who that's for, whoever wants to share that.
For sure. So the More Than Two Essentials series is a series of short books. They're kind of snack-sized books on special topics in non-monogamy that Thornapple Press does. And so each one is by a different author, and they cover all kinds of fascinating little topics. And I'm so lucky that as a substantive editor, I've actually gotten to work with a lot of the authors on those. In fact, I think maybe even all of them, or close to all of them.
Wow. All of them, yeah.
All of them so far, yeah.
That's fascinating. Except yours. I was your editor on yours.
Except my own. Fair enough. So like non-monogamy and sex work, I think, is one of the ones coming out soon. Mm-hmm. There was non-monogamy and death, non-monogamy and neurodivergence, or neurodiversity. Some really, they're really chewy, interesting little nuggets of wisdom on these particular topics. And I guess because of my blogging history and general, being a weirdo about town, I got, even the folks from Thornapple had sort of poked me a couple of times to see if I might have a little book in me. And I kept on saying no because of some changes that had happened in my life where I wasn't really actively doing non-monogamy anymore. I kept on thinking, I don't know if I have anything relevant to say. It's not that I don't have useful experience to share, but I feel disconnected from it because it's not present at this time in my life, and that feels weird. And who am I to write anything anymore? And then after a few pokes, I sort of sat there and thought about it, and ended up sort of realizing that maybe that was the thing. Maybe that actually was the thing I should be writing about. Was the experience of having done it for a good chunk of my life and then stopped. But it wasn't because I had suddenly changed my mind about whether non-monogamy was okay. I just didn't have the bandwidth for it in my life. I was too focused on healing from long-term illness and, sort of putting my life back together after it sort of, disintegrated over the course of several years. And the idea of investing at that time, even in one partnership, was a lot, let alone several. And in the times that I have invested in one partnership in the last while, I have had no desire to make more people happen in my life. But again, it wasn't like a shift of ethical standpoint, right? And it wasn't like all of my past experience somehow disappeared, and it wasn't like my way of thinking about relationships changed. It was really a capacity thing, and just sort of like the place that I reached in my life. And so that's where the germ of an idea came from for this book. So I put together an outline and pitched it, and then I wrote it mostly near the end of last year and early into this year. And it was the reading I got. So I had this framework, these ideas, and I wanted to put them in conversation because it's not. I mean, there's some elements of my own story in there, but it's not a memoir, right? This is an idea. And so I started thinking about, okay, so how do people get here? How do people get to a place where maybe they've done it and have stopped? What leads people there? And so I came up with some pathways, and then I did some reading on the various pathways. And so I sort of put my ideas in conversation with the ideas of other thinkers and people who are not writing in the realm of non-monogamy, but whose insights I thought would be really relevant in this context. And if you look at the numbers, at any given time, the statistics we have, and I mean, I'm sure that, more research would teach us many more things, but, it's more or less understood that about 5% of the population in North America anyhow is non-monogamous at any given time, but there's actually almost 3 times that many who've done it at some point, but who aren't anymore. And so to me, that's like, okay, I'm not alone here. Like this is a widely shared experience, and there's lots of people who've had lots of trajectories to get there. So let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm. That's a really powerful statistic that I hadn't really thought of, because those folks that are in the community, I think we've all heard those statistics, right? Like 20% of people in their lifetime, it's as common as owning a cat. You know,
Yeah.
But I didn't really do the math that, wow, that means that, roughly, 15% of the, that's the people that may have practiced at some point but aren't now. So that's really powerful. So would you say that this book is definitely written for that type of a reader, or is there a little bit more of a broader reach there, do you think?
Well, I think those readers, don't really have anything for them yet, so I'm hoping it'll reach them. But I also think that it's, a lot of the pathways that my main 3 ideas of how people might get here are quite broadly, right? Other than sort of just like accidentally ending up that way. I think, one of them has to do with sex drive or like sort of libido and, excitement about reaching out to new partners. Another one is stress and trauma and the effects that has on our life and the time and effort that it can take to invest in healing. And then the third is contentment in solitude and the way that some of us sort of get to a place where we just really, really enjoy our solitude and prize it above other things. And so any combination of those 3 and all the kinds of very specific stories that can happen within those 3, I think covers maybe not all, but I think a lot of the ways that people end up in a post-non-monogamous situation. But the thing is that you can experience all 3 of those trajectories, not end up post-non-monogamous, but maybe still want to be thinking about how those are affecting your life. So I hope that, that this might be useful for people who aren't post-non-monogamous yet, or who knows, maybe won't get there. But yeah, a lot of it's just about like, how do we get where we are?
Yeah, I love that. I think I think it's a beautiful niche and a hole that you're filling in a lovely way with that guide. One question I have for you, this even came up with some clients yesterday, was the question between whether you're thinking consensual non-monogamy or maybe polyamory as either an orientation versus a choice. So I don't know if that's addressed in that book or not, but in the context of what you're discussing, it's an interesting thing. If can you turn it off, or do you change your identity? Like, I don't know if you can touch on that a little bit from your perspective.
Yeah, it's very much in the book, and actually even I have had some interesting conversation about that because we have not totally dissimilar trajectories, but we don't identify the same way. I can let Eve speak to that on her own behalf, but yeah, I think even for people who, for some people, they consider themselves non-monogamous no matter what happens. And for other people, it's really something they're doing for a certain amount of time or within the context of a certain relationship, and it never sort of hits the realm of identity for them, right? And it's not, I don't feel like I'm qualified to tell people what their identities should be, so that's not in any way the purpose, but I do think it's an interesting discussion to open and to ask that question, how do you feel about your own non-monogamy? Is it something that you are, whether you're doing it or not? Is it situational? And at what point do you shift identities? And, if you ever do, and does identity determine how you choose things, or is it there's like a whole chunk of the book that's exactly about playing with that question. And I guess for my own, where I landed on it for myself was I wanted to have a term that would accurately describe the fact that I have not defaulted to non-monogamy, back to monogamy in some way, right? I haven't changed my mind, but I am choosing to do things differently right now in my life because that serves my needs and where I'm at better. So I wanted to find a way to express that non-monogamy is always going to be how my thought process works, how my ethical system works, all the values that I learned through non-monogamy or that I brought into non-monogamy with me, those are still present and haven't changed. But I don't want to sort of, I just wanted a way to express that that's the thing that I had stopped choosing to do for the moment. And that moment for me may last forever, or it may change again. I don't think it's a permanent state, right? But that question is one that I think each of us can stand to wrestle with almost no matter where we're at on the spectrum of what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very interesting question. And then, even more complex when you look at it through the lens of that book. So is there a term that you kind of came up with, or just like a phrasing of how you would describe it? Like,
that's it. Post-nonmonogamy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Post-nonmonogamy. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
I am post-nonmonogamous. Yeah. Because, you say that to somebody and it does not say, oh, you're you're a monogamous person. They're going to all, I'm not saying, it's not like I drop it in casual conversation very often,
right.
But yeah, if I had to pick a term right now, that would be it for me.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. And it's so interesting just that there's so many acronyms now. I wonder if that'll start to get picked up, PNM,
Oh dear.
Yeah. I know.
I did not mean to contribute to the tidal wave of acronyms. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's interesting. But also, given the work that I do with the podcast and coaching, people are dropping acronyms all the time. I have to go look them up. Like, what's that acronym name? So I wonder if this will be a new one that I'll get in the lexicon. But I think that's fascinating, is that we are in a world where we're creating language.
Oh, for sure. And that's been true for a long time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's pretty amazing.
Very much.
And I'd love to hear from you, Eve. Is there anything you'd like to add to any of that?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a brief note about the More Than Two Essentials series first, to add that it's also all Canadian authors. So the the non-monogamy literature does tend to be very U.S. centric, and so I'm trying to add some Canadian perspectives to that, and it's also part of the identity of Thornapple Press as a Canadian publisher. And all of those books can be found at morethantwo.ca. That's morethantwo.ca for Canada. And to go to the question of how Andrea mentioned that we've had similar trajectories in a lot of ways, but I identify differently. I still identify as non-monogamous, although I'm not, I'm currently single-ish. I'm solo. I'm not actively looking for other relationships. Don't really feel like I'm all that emotionally available. Don't have the capacity for a variety of reasons. But to me, and it's funny, I know, I've learned I am actually I can be perfectly happy in one relationship. So it's not like I need to have multiple partners, or that I do this sort of need fulfillment poly thing where I have different partners for different needs. For me, it's more that I know, even if I'm with someone and I love them and I'm attached, I can fall in love with someone else and it doesn't affect that initial partnership. And for me, that ability to have those feelings and honor those feelings and have my other relationships develop on trajectories that are, that honor those connections, that's really core to who I am. So even if I was in a relationship that was with only one person and neither one of us happened to be dating anyone else, I would not be able to have that relationship be closed. Because to me, closing the relationship says that there is some limit that I have to place on my other connections that feels very just unnatural and wrong to me and to who I am. So that's sort of how I conceptualize my own identity in non-monogamy. So, while on the surface, you could say maybe I'm kind of post-non-monogamous because of the way my lifestyle looks. For me, that doesn't sit with who I am. It doesn't sit with what feels right to me. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Beautiful.
But some people have really resonated with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that perspective too. And that's what's so beautiful about having these conversations, is seeing it from all these different perspectives. And again, helping people identify with that. So I'd love to move on to More Than Two, Cultivating Non-Monogamous Relationships with Kindness and Integrity. And I certainly love the tagline. So from a place of complete curiosity, a lot of us who are listening are very familiar with the first More Than Two book. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about the light bulb moment of writing a second. I don't know if you'd call it an edition. I guess it's almost like a different book, would you say? Or how would either of you describe that?
It's both. I mean, it is, it was a revision of the first edition, but it ended up being a very, very deep and complete revision. I think much to both of our surprise, actually. So it is based on the framework of the old book. The bones are there. Some of the old text is there, but, we have estimated that about probably 90% of it has been, cut, replaced, rewritten. But there is text that you'll recognize as well from the original. So, one of the things that we had to grapple with is that this was not the book that we would have sat down and written if we were to write a book from scratch today. So we were constrained by what was already there. But basically, what happened, I don't know if there was a light bulb moment really, but I think that over time, I changed from the first edition. I grew up, the world grew up. I read a lot more. I learned a lot more things, had a lot of experiences. And, bit by bit, I started to think, oh, well, there's stuff in there I would say differently now. There's stuff in there I wouldn't say. There's stuff in there that has actually not been as great advice as I thought it was. So it was probably around 5 years ago that I started to think like, oh, I would really like to be able to make some changes to this book. I couldn't do that at the time because of, shared copyright with my first co-author. So it was about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, that we were finally able to reach an agreement for me to purchase copyright in the book. And I got full rights, including what in Canada we call moral rights, which means like the whole book belongs to me. And I can do anything I want with the content, and I am not required to credit the original co-author or anything like that. But then I kind of panicked because it was like, okay, it's a 500-page book. I haven't looked at it really in 10 years now, and I have to revise it. And, a lot of the stuff in there is linked to really painful experiences or trauma. And so I kind of knew where I needed to start. And so I asked Andrea if they would come in as an editor. And, initially they had sort of a set of discrete tasks to do, Originally, it was just removing the original co-author's stories. We later decided to remove all of the personal stories. Can get into that if you want to, but there were things like, queering it up, some gender-neutral language, looking at ableism. But then as they got into the edit, and they can address this a bit more, but we started to find that actually there were places that really needed their voice. And also that the revision needed to be much deeper than originally thought. And so that was when we started having discussions about them becoming a co-author. And Andrea, I don't know if you want to continue from that.
Yeah, I mean, it was like an evolving process over the course of a number of months. And it was, it sort of went from a task list to a really delightful collaboration where we were meeting every week and talking about this and that. And, I think, and I've said this at a few of our book launches, but, if you're editing someone else's work and it comes out sounding like you wrote it, then you did a bad job as an editor. And so there, as we went, and, my main task was get a whole bunch of stuff done to sort of ease the burden on Eve of doing it.
And to be clear, just to cut in for a second, the idea was Andrea would do a first cut and then I would dive in and do my pass. So it was sort of like getting the manuscript ready for me, removing some of the landmines and so on, which did happen, but also it ended up being a much bigger collaboration and iterative thing than had originally been intended. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Continue.
No. I agreed, all of that. And interesting for me too as a reader, right? Because I read it when it first came out, but I too hadn't touched it in 10 years. And I didn't have the depth of relationship with that text, certainly because, I didn't write it as compared to Eve. But I didn't remember, when I was reading it, I was like, oh, wow, I don't remember that from the first read. And no, I can totally see how shifts in language, shifts in thinking, new perspectives. I mean, there's just, it needed a bigger update whether I was involved or not. And it worked. It made, I don't know, it just sort of ended up making sense. And I'm really grateful to have been included. I didn't go in thinking I would be, but it's been really delightful. And so, and the other thing that I think is a real benefit of the collaboration is that I think either of us could have written the book on our own in our own ways, but the collaboration, because we come from, we overlap certainly in our politics and in our way of thinking about certain things, but our life experiences are quite different, and our realms of interest in terms of the types of things that we've read and the kinds of studies we've done also quite different. So we would often end up having like I'll draft this chunk of this chapter, and then the other person would look at it and go, yeah, that's great. I like what you've done, but if we're going to talk about this, we also definitely have to mention this or that other thing because, and so there's a lot of that yes and kind of all the way through the book, where both of our voices end up kind of almost in dialogue within the text. And we don't identify ourselves. It's a we the whole way through. It's not me and then Eve and then Eve and me, right? But it really is the fruit of us sort of blending our thinking and blending our brains and being in contact and being in conversation and having these like regular conversations like, okay, what about this thing? How do you want to address, So yeah, it's very it's deeply collaborative on every page.
That is really, really neat and exciting. Yeah. I can't wait to read it. If you had to maybe in like just a sentence or two or however you want, or maybe in a short bullet points, what would you say is kind of some of the main differences between the first More Than Two versus this new version?
Oh, so the whole, I would say like the biggest changes are the first, second, and fourth parts of the book have all been, but like the most, I think the part 3 is probably maybe the most similar. No, maybe not. I don't know. It's all been reworked, but the first part was really heavily reworked. The ethics chapter in particular, which was foundational to the whole book, has been very heavily redone. There are still some things you'll recognize in there. The Relationship Bill of Rights is still in there. There are still 2 axioms, but one of the axioms is different. We've added a very long chapter on abuse. It's the longest chapter in the book. So much so that we talked about making it its own book, but we decided it needed to be in this one. We end specifically addressing abuse in non-monogamous structures. The sex chapters, there were 2 sex chapters. They've been largely replaced by a new one chapter on sex, pleasure, risk, and health. The jealousy chapter has been almost completely replaced. Lots of stuff like that. Heavy reworking to the chapters on self-work and communication. We've added a section on discernment. So, there's like courage, there's still the focus on courage, but then we've added like discernment, which is like, you don't always, I don't know, Andrew, if you want to touch on the discernment question.
Yeah. It sure is. It certainly was one of the things that came up a lot as the yes and well, I guess people just have to really think about it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's
because a lot of these things, it's like, well, what you do depends so much on the situation you're in, and we can't tell what situation you're in. So how do you discern that? Like, are people acting in good faith? Because if they are, then this is the way to approach it, and if they're not, then this is the way to approach it. Are you in a healthy relationship? Is this a secure relationship? All of those things impact the paths you choose to address these questions. And a lot of advice seems to be kind of one size fits all, and it's really not. So,
yeah, we wanted to make room for a lot of different possibilities and try to expand the thinking there. I know that in the way that we looked at discernment, a lot of it is, you don't have to like reality, but it's really useful if that's where you can start. So trying to figure out what, you know what I mean? And like what's actually happening, what are people's actual intentions, and so on and so forth. And yeah, it's complicated. I mean, there are no easy answers in any of this. It's relationship shit. Like this is humans being messy and human, right? So, but having something that doesn't presume what's going on, which I think is one of the reasons why that abuse chapter is so foundational, right? Because a lot of what comes after it is, as long as it's not abuse, here's useful stuff. But if it's abuse, then none of this is going to be useful, right? Because you can't sit down to have a good faith conversation and try this new communication technique with someone who's being abusive. That's never going to get you to good places, and it might actually, perpetuate or help perpetuate a dynamic, right? So there's a lot of sort of sorting through. And I mean, it's partly also why we, in the ethics chapter, we set out really specifically our own values, our shared values, and the specific ones we each bring to the book, and then also the assumptions that we're making about the reader. Because because at the same time as, you know, everything requires lots of thought and discernment, we also don't want to create a situation where it's like, anything's okay as long as you say it is. And because that's not also really exact, that's not it either, right? Like,
Yeah.
So, you know, there's people who may want to make decisions about their relationships that we don't think are a good idea. And if that's what you want to do, this book might actually not be for you, right? So.
How fascinating. I'm really excited to read it. I did read the original. I will be completely honest. It was so big that I think I made it about 60% of the way through the book. So
it is an audiobook.
Oh, okay. So is this book about the same thing, about 500 pages?
Yeah, same length.
Okay. Well, good to know. Good to know.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to know that there's an audiobook version as well.
I just also wanted to add in terms of the changes, because this I think is really important. There's a lot more, it's much more like inclusive of like queer identities. There's a lot more presence of like kink and BDSM, inclusion that, more inclusive of like, ace identities, asexual and aromantic, allowance for, you know, inclusion of like really intimate relationships that are not sexual or that are not romantic or both, queer platonic relationships and so on. So and also an examination of multiple examinations of gender dynamics and particularly the way patriarchy and misogyny can play out in polycules.
Wow.
Well, and also, I mean, just to add in, because it ties into what you're saying, Eve, is that, I mean, I think it's almost like all the space that in the original was taken up by personal stories, I think is now taken up by references to other thinkers. Right. Yes. And like the like, you know, because Eve's done like tons of research and reading and training in areas around restorative justice and other sorts of things. And, you know, I have this long scholarly background in reading about, you know, gender studies and queerness. And so like we each sort of brought our reference points. And I mean, not even, I'm saying scholarship, and that's true, but like we also quote from the fiction that we've read that really impacted us and that kind of thing. So it's like lots and lots of other voices in there that, that just wasn't really a big part of how the first edition was written.
Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled, and I'm deeply grateful for you two collaborating and putting this new book out into the world for our community and the world at large. So maybe before we start to wrap it up, is there anything that comes to mind in terms of like what was maybe the most rewarding aspect of collaborating together and writing this book? Anything come to mind?
Who wants to go first on this one?
Yeah.
Even I have discovered that we are both inclined to defer to the other one to speak first.
Because
so we have to sort of catch ourselves.
What was the most rewarding aspect? Is that the question?
Yeah, the most rewarding aspect in collaborating together to write More Than Two, Cultivating Non-Monogamous Relationships with Kindness and Integrity. And I love the title, by the way.
Just to note, the official title is More Than Two, Second Edition.
Okay.
So second edition is part of the title, and that's we added that just for. I noticed that the Ethical Slut did that as well. It's Ethical Slut third edition, so I'm like, I'm just gonna do the same thing to just for branding and to help distinguish them. But for as far as like the collaboration, I mean, I really enjoyed. We had weekly phone calls for several months, and that was really great. And then when it ended and we like finally finished the manuscript, I was like, oh. We're not going to do that anymore. First, we're in a book tour together and seeing each other all the time. But that was lovely. And I think, what's that?
I said, and then what?
You're right. And yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed, you know, as I mentioned before, it was a big, scary task for me. And I really liked not feeling like I was in it alone. I think it would have been a really, really different experience for me. And there was someone kind of holding my hand through the whole thing. So that was really nice. Really nice.
That's awesome.
And so what could have been like a really, honestly, a like potentially re-traumatizing experience became something that was really like, you know, healing in a lot of ways. So,
yeah. That's amazing. I love hearing that. How about for you, Andrea?
I'm picturing the little smiley face emoji with the hearts all around it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, you know, interesting. So my collaboration with Eve, both on this and the work that we, you know, because Eve was my editor for Post-Nonmonogamy. I mean, I've been writing, the first time I was published as a writer, I was 14 years old. And I've been steadily published ever since in all kinds of different places, but I've never had a book. I've never had a book to my own name. And so to have like my own book and then this collaboration with, on a project that is got a huge reputation. I mean, this is a very well-known book. So to sort of then get to sort of jump in on that, it's a lot of books for me all in 1 year, and having someone who has had, I mean, it's sort of like even like, we have like a table full of hats and we just keep on switching them out. But Eve definitely is the only one here with a publisher hat. And so working with a publisher who can also be, a friend and also someone who shares some aspects of my identity and who understands, the context we're all coming from here. I don't know. It's been really, I think a lot of people's first book publishing experiences are probably not nearly this good and caring and attentive and careful and professional even, right? And it's been, and I mean, there have been some times where, Eve will say something and I'll be like, okay, sure. But I've never done this before though. You need to tell me how it works, because just because I know how to make sentences sound good doesn't mean I know the mechanics of all this, right? So it's definitely been really great as a learning experience for me. I think I got a very gentle and thorough and kind learning experience here that not everyone gets to have. So,
wow.
Separately from like the enjoyment, I mean, I agree with everything you've already said about the enjoyment of the collaboration itself, but like, this is my angle on it that, then this is the different part that I bring to the table is being kind of a newbie in some ways.
Yeah. Well, congratulations to both of you for doing these fine works that I'm sure a lot of people, they're going to help a lot of people. So where can people find your work, and any maybe parting thoughts for our listeners?
So again, I'll just plug morethantwo.ca, which is currently a listing of all of the books in the More Than Two Essential series, including this one. And there are links there to where you can purchase everything. Thornapple.ca also has our catalog and links to all of the books. I am pretty much everywhere as Eve Rickert, Instagram, Blue Sky, Facebook, TikTok, although I never post there, YouTube, and so on. And then the book itself is on Instagram at MTT Book. It's on Facebook as More Than Two Book. And then Thornapple Press is on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn and YouTube as Thornapple Press.
You are everywhere.
If you want
to. Amazing.
Andrea, did you add anything?
Absolutely. I am on Twitter, and it's the only place in the world that I continue to dead name. It's always going to be Twitter to me. Screw that guy. And Blue Sky and Instagram, and I have an author page on Facebook, so I'm pretty easy to find on social media. Zanin is an unusual last name, although if you go looking for it, you'll probably find an Italian pastry chef or two. But I'm not hard to find on social media. And I'm on the author page with Thornapple Press and morethantwo.ca as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for reaching out and contributing to our podcast here. We're deeply honored to be able to share your work and some of your story. So I appreciate your time, your vulnerability, your courage, your strength, and the dedication and perseverance that you put into these works. So just thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard, are struggling with some aspect of your relationships, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit to work with me as your relationship coach, here's what I invite you to do next. Head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. That's lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply, and book a call to speak with me. I'll get on the phone with you for about 45 minutes, and we'll get you crystal clear on 3 things. Number 1, exactly what's not working well in your relationships right now. Number 2, ideally where you'd like to be and what might be getting in the way. And number 3, the exact strategy to get you there, helping to close that gap. Remember, creating healthy, open relationships does not typically happen by itself. Many often need expert guidance to make it happen. We've helped clients all over the world to feel safe, happy, and secure in open relationships while not losing their mind or their cherished partners. To see if we can help you do the same, head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. I'm Kitty Chambliss, and let's talk soon.